My mom is putting me in charge to read a chapter. My name is Sky, and I'll be reading Chapter 4, The Secret Workers for you. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with the story. You see, Charlie, he said, not very long ago, there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then, one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, and to never come back. But why? Asked Charlie. Because of spies. Spies? Yes. All of the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful candies that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started to send spies in to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a special thing was made. And did they go back to their own factories and tell? Asked Charlie. They must have, answered Grandpa Joe, because soon after that, Fickelgruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then, Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavor, no matter how much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making candy balloons that he could blow up into huge sizes before he popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on, and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, "This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere! I shall have to close the factory!" But he didn't do that, Charlie said. Oh, yes, he did. He told all of the workers he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain. And suddenly, Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimney stopped smoking, and the machine stopped whirring. And from then on, not a single chocolate or candy was made. Not a soul went in or out. And even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely. Months and months went by, Grandpa Joe went on, but the factory still remained closed. And everyone said, "Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice and made such marvelous things. But he's finished now. It's all over." Then something amazing happened. One day, in the early morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen coming out the tops of the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. "What's going on?" they cried. "Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again?" They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open, and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no, the great iron gates were still locked, securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. "But the factory's working," the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the melting of chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid his long, bony finger on Charlie's knee and said softly, "But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the window of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small dark shadows moving about behind the frosted glass windows." "Shadows of who?" said Charlie quickly. That's exactly what everyone wanted to know. "The place is full of workers," the people shouted. "But nobody's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. No one ever comes out either." Good boy. Stay. "But there was no question at all," said Grandpa Joe. "The factory was working. It's gone running ever since, for these last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and candies have been turning out more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now, when Mr. Wonka invests some of the new wonderful candy, neither Mr. Fickelgrubber, nor Mr. Prodnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody else is to copy it. no spies can go into the factory to find out how it is made. But Grandpa, who? Cried Charlie. Who is Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory? Nobody knows, Charlie. But that's absurd. Hasn't somebody asked Mr. Wonka? Nobody sees him anymore. He never comes out. The only things that come out of the place are chocolates and candies. They come through a special trapdoor in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they are picked up every day by the post office trucks. But Grandpa, what sort of people are they that do the work in there? My dear boy, said Grandpa Joe, that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We know only one thing about them. The people who work there are very small. They faint shadows sometimes appear behind the windows. Especially late at night when the lights are on, are those of tiny people, no taller than my knee. There aren't any such people, Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitingly. Have you heard? He held up the paper so that they could see the huge headline. Wonka Factory to be opened at last to a lucky few. And that's the end of chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed it. And tomorrow my mom will be reading chapter 5. Okay, I finished.